For 13 days in October 1962, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. No warning sirens, no explosions, just decisions made behind closed doors in Washington and Moscow, decisions that could determine whether entire cities would survive or disappear at any moment. A single order, misunderstood, delayed, or taken too far, could have unleashed a chain reaction no one could stop. Nuclear missiles were already in place, armed, ready, and aimed. For the first time in history, the United States faced a direct nuclear threat just miles from its own shores. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days that brought the world closer to destruction than it had ever been before, and the moments when everything could have gone wrong. In the early 1960s, the Cold War had reached a dangerous intensity. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer just competing for influence. They were preparing for the possibility of nuclear conflict. Both sides had developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking across the globe, but geography still mattered. And in 1959, something changed that would alter the balance entirely. Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, after a revolution led by Fidel Castro, the island nation shifted toward the Soviet sphere of influence. What had once been a neighboring country with close ties to the United States became a strategic outpost for its most powerful adversary. For Washington, the implications were immediate. A Soviet-aligned government so close to American territory introduced a new level of risk, one that could not be ignored. Tensions escalated quickly. In 1961, the United States supported an attempt to overthrow Castro in the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation collapsed, strengthening Castro's position and pushing Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. From Moscow's perspective, the situation presented an opportunity. Under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union began considering a bold move, one that could shift the balance of power. If nuclear missiles could be placed in Cuba, the United States would be within direct range, minutes away from impact. It was a strategic gamble, but also a calculated one, because at the time, the United States already had nuclear weapons positioned closer to the Soviet Union, in Europe and Turkey. To Khrushchev, placing missiles in Cuba wasn't just an escalation. It was a response, a way to level the playing field. And so, in secret, the operation began. Soviet ships carried missiles, launch equipment, and personnel across the Atlantic. Construction crews worked quickly, building launch sites hidden from view. The goal was simple: complete the deployment before the United States could react. For weeks, it worked. American intelligence had suspicions, but no confirmation, until one flight changed everything. High above Cuba, an American two reconnaissance aircraft captured images that would alter the course of history. Clear, undeniable evidence. Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction, just miles from U.S. territory. When those images reached Washington, the situation became immediately clear. This wasn't a distant threat. It was direct, immediate, and potentially catastrophic. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the discovery. The implications were staggering. If those missiles became operational, they could strike major American cities in minutes. There would be almost no time to respond, no time to evacuate, no margin for error. The United States now faced one of the most dangerous strategic decisions in its history. Do nothing and accept the new reality. Launch an airstrike and risk immediate escalation. Or take a path that could contain the crisis without triggering war. But every option carried consequences, and none of them guaranteed safety. Because once both sides began to act, there might be no way to stop what came next. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where a single decision can shape the fate of millions, consider subscribing, because what followed over the next 13 days would test not just military power, but judgment, restraint, and the ability to step back when the world was already too close to the edge. Inside Washington, the pressure was building. Every hour mattered. Every movement was being watched. And somewhere just beyond the horizon, the missiles were getting closer to ready. Inside the White House, the response had to be immediate, but it also had to be precise. because this wasn't just a military problem, it was a global one. President John F. Kennedy assembled a small group of advisors, military leaders, intelligence officials, and senior policymakers. This group will become known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. Their task was simple in theory: stop the missiles. But in reality, nothing about it was simple. The first option on the table was the most direct: airstrikes. Destroy the missile sites before they became operational. It was fast, decisive, militarily effective, but it came with a risk no one could ignore. The Soviet Union might respond immediately, not just in Cuba, but in Europe. Berlin, already a flashpoint, could become the next battlefield. And once military action began, escalation could spiral beyond control. The second option was even more dangerous: a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Remove the threat completely. Eliminate the missile sites and the government that allowed them. But this would almost certainly trigger a direct confrontation with Soviet forces already on the island. And if American troops engaged Soviet troops, nuclear war would no longer be a possibility. It would be a probability. Then there was a third option, less aggressive, but far more complex: a naval blockade, or, as it would be carefully called, a quarantine. Instead of attacking, the United States would use its naval power to surround Cuba and prevent any additional Soviet military equipment from reaching the island. It was a show of force, a clear message, but not an immediate act of war. It gave time for negotiation, time for pressure to build, time for the Soviet Union to reconsider. But even this approach carried enormous risk, because if Soviet ships attempted to break the blockade, American forces would have to respond. And a single confrontation at sea could ignite something far larger. The decision would define the crisis. After intense debate, Kennedy chose a blockade. It was a calculated move, firm enough to demonstrate resolve, but restrained enough to leave room for diplomacy. On October 22, 1962, the president addressed the nation. The message was direct. Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba, and the United States would not accept their presence. American naval forces moved into position, forming a defensive perimeter around the island. Warships took their stations. Aircraft carriers prepared for action. Strategic bombers were placed on alert. Across the military, readiness levels increased. The United States was preparing for the possibility that the next step could be war. Around the world, the reaction was immediate. Allies watched closely. Adversaries calculated their next move. And ordinary people, many of whom had never experienced the reality of nuclear fear, began to understand just how close things had come. In Moscow, the situation was just as tense. Nikita Khrushchev now faced a decision of his own: continue forward and challenge a blockade, or step back and risk appearing weak. Soviet ships were already en route to Cuba, loaded with equipment, possibly carrying additional military components. As they approached the American naval line, the world watched, because this was the moment where words would give way to action. If the ships kept moving, the U.S. Navy would have to intercept them. And if that happened, there would be no guarantee that it would end peacefully. Inside command centers, radar screens tracked the movement of every vessel. Distances closed, time narrowed, and then something unexpected happened. The ships slowed, some turned around, others stopped short of the blockade line. It was the first sign that the crisis might not escalate immediately, but it didn't mean it was over, because while the naval confrontation had been avoided, the missiles in Cuba were still there, still being assembled, still moving closer to operational readiness. And above the island, American reconnaissance flights continued, each mission gathering new intelligence, each flight carrying risk, because now the stakes were even higher, and the margin for error even smaller. Then, on October 27th, the tension reached its peak. Two reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba was suddenly targeted. A surface-to-air missile launched, and for the first time in the crisis, an American aircraft was shot down. The pilot was killed, and in that moment, everything changed, because now the United States had lost a man under direct Soviet action, and the pressure to respond became almost impossible to ignore. The moment the 2 went down, the crisis entered its most dangerous phase. Inside Washington, the news spread quickly. An American pilot had been killed over Cuba, not by accident, not by miscalculation, but by a Soviet missile. For many inside the XCOM, the conclusion was immediate. This was an act of war, and it demanded a response. Military leaders pressed for action. Airstrike plans were revisited. Targets were identified. Timelines were discussed. Everything was ready. All it would take was the order, but President John F. Kennedy hesitated because he understood something critical. Once that order was given, control would be lost. Airstrikes would lead to retaliation. Retaliation would lead to escalation. And escalation could lead to nuclear exchange. The pressure inside the room was immense. On one side, the need to respond. On the other, the need to avoid catastrophe. And outside those walls, time was running out. At the same time, the situation was becoming even more unstable, far beyond Cuba. In another part of the world, near the Soviet Union's borders, the second 2 aircraft accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace during a reconnaissance mission. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept. American forces prepared to respond. For a brief moment, 2 separate incidents, thousands of miles apart, threatened to collide into something far larger, a chain reaction, one that neither side had fully planned for. And yet, even in that chaos, communication continued. Messages passed between Washington and Moscow, carefully worded, strategically timed, each side searching for a way out without appearing to back down. Then a breakthrough. A message from Nikita Khrushchev arrived in Washington. The tone was different, less confrontational, more urgent. He proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade the island. It was a path forward, but it came with complications, because soon after, a second message arrived. Harder, more demanding. This time, Khrushchev added a condition. The United States must also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. For Kennedy, this created a dilemma. Publicly accepting the second demand could weaken the United States' position with its allies. Rejecting it entirely could collapse the negotiation. And all the while, the military clock kept ticking. Missiles in Cuba were nearing operational readiness. Forces on both sides remained on high alert. Any delay could close the window for diplomacy. Inside the White House, a decision was made. The United States would respond to the first message, accepting the removal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for a non-invasion pledge. The second demand would be handled quietly, privately, through back-channel communication. It was a delicate strategy, one that required precision, because if handled incorrectly, it could unravel everything. As night fell, the response was sent, and then the waiting began. No one knew how Moscow would react. No one knew if the message would be accepted, and no one knew if, somewhere along the chain of command, another decision had already been made. Because in a crisis like this, not every action was controlled from the top. Local commanders, field officers, missile crews, any one of them could make a move that changed everything. The world stood still, balanced between escalation and resolution, between action and restraint. And for the first time in those 13 days, the outcome depended not on power, but on judgment. The answer came the next morning, a message from Moscow. Clear, direct, final. Nikita Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba and withdraw the weapons. The immediate threat was over. The missiles would not become operational. The United States had held its ground, and the world stepped back from the edge. Behind the scenes, a second agreement quietly took shape. The United States would remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, without public announcement, without spectacle, and without undermining its position on the global stage. It was a resolution built not on victory alone, but on restraint, because both sides understood something that no doctrine could fully capture. If either had pushed this a little further, the outcome might have been irreversible. For 13 days, the balance of power had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. And in the end, it was not firepower that determined the outcome. It was control. The the ability to pause, to assess, to choose a path that avoided escalation, even when pressure demanded action. For the United States, the crisis reinforced a critical reality. Strength wasn't just about weapons. It was about how those weapons were managed, how decisions were made, and how responsibility was exercised when the stakes were highest. The U.S. response, measured, calculated, and backed by overwhelming capability, demonstrated that power and restraint could exist together, that a nation could project strength without triggering destruction. And that combination would define the next phase of the Cold War. In the aftermath, changes came quickly. Direct communication between Washington and Moscow was established. The hotline to prevent future misunderstandings. Nuclear strategies were re-examined, and both sides gained a deeper understanding of how close they had come to something they could not control. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't just a confrontation, it was a warning, a moment when the world saw clearly what nuclear war would mean and how easily it could begin. In the years that followed, the Cold War continued. Conflicts remained, tensions persisted, but the memory of those 13 days stayed with those who had lived through them, a reminder that even in the most intense rivalry, there are limits that cannot be crossed, because beyond those limits, there is no victory, only consequences. And in October 1962, when everything hung in the balance, the United States did more than respond. It held the line. If you found this story as powerful as we did, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because the Cold War was shaped not only by the battles that were fought, but by the moments when the world chose not to fight at all.